Hello, I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. Thank you for joining me. Continuing here to look at Romans chapter 11, where Paul is explaining that God has not separated Israel from his love, and that is an assurance that is promised to us at the end of Romans 8 is also true. We can't be separated from his love. Brings us to a passage that I think a number of Bible students take in different ways, understand in different ways. I'm going to present what I think represents most of the New Testament revelation. It maintains a distinction between the people of Israel as God's people and the church as God's people, that they are both God's people, but they are not the same people. In fact, I believe that is not the totality of the people of God. But that's a study for another time. So yesterday we left off at verse 10 in Romans 11, where we saw if the first piece of dough is holy. You need to put this in the context of first century people, or and people still do this today, where they form some dough. It has leavening in it, and they bake with that, and they set some aside, and they continue to allow that dough to become the basis of leavening further dough. And so the idea is if you've got this dough that's set apart, then if you add another bit, mix up some other flour or green water, and you mix that into this, that it too then is going to be leavened. So the dough is holy, then the lump also is holy. So that was image number one. Then he changes his metaphor, and he says, and if the root is holy, talking about rootstock. I live in an area where we have a lot of apple orchards. And sometimes there are certain rootstock that is better for grafting in other fruit than it is for the fruit that it itself produces. And so if the root is holy, then the branches are too. So he's switching metaphors here about taking something from the outside and bringing it in to something different. So he says in Romans chapter 11, verse 17, I'm going to just read here for a while. But if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive were grafted in among them, and you've become a partaker with them of the rich root or the fat of the olive tree. Do not be arrogant then toward those branches, or do not boast against those branches. But if you do boast, remember that it is not you who supports the root, but the root supports you. And you will say then, the branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. And he says, and indeed this is right. They were broken off for or due to their unbelief, but you stand by your faith. Therefore, do not be conceited, or do not set your frame of mind higher, obviously, than is necessary, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, he will not spare you either. I'll stop there for a moment. One of the things that some people take from this passage is that the root is Israel, and Gentiles are now being grafted into Israel. So there are Bible students within evangelicalism that teach that Israel is always the people of God. And so today we have what they would refer to as the new Israel, and that would be the church that includes Gentiles also. There isn't really good biblical evidence for this in the New Testament, because most of the time Paul plainly and clearly distinguishes us as believers from Israel in texts. And he never once applies the title Israel to the church or to Gentiles in the church. So I don't think that that's an accurate point of view, and maybe another time we will head down that road and we will demonstrate that in more detail. But I believe what we have here, and I think what's helpful for us to understand, is to look at the rootstock into which we are grafted as being the place where God has been working. Now, that's not a hard thing to see if you go back and read your Old Testament. We have the first 2,000 years of human history covered in Genesis 1 through Genesis 12. And it covers it very quickly. And then it slows down when we get to Genesis 12, when God calls Abraham. And from that time on, which is roughly, just to make it easy dating on a timeline, around 2000 BC. I know that's not exactly accurate, but I always think if you think 2000 BC, the call of Abraham, 1500 BC, the giving of the law in Israel coming out of Egypt, 1000 BC, the life of David, and around 500 BC, we're talking about the exile and the return of the exile of Israel. You kind of have some broad breakouts of time, and I think that may be helpful then for us to think in those terms as we walk through some of this material. So for really 2,000 years prior to the time that Christ went to the cross and died, for 2,000 years, God had been dealing primarily with the family of Abraham. And as he's already demonstrated in the 2 previous chapters, not the entirety of Abraham's family, but those that through Isaac. And not the entirety of those that came through Isaac, but those that came through Jacob. So God continued to narrow it down there for a couple of generations. And what he did was he gave covenant promises to Abraham and then extended those covenant promises. They were promised to his descendants, and so he confirms them to Isaac and he confirms them to Jacob. And when God brings Israel out of Egypt, he confirms that, yes, these are your covenant promises because I gave them to your fathers. Now, I want you to look with me in Ephesians 2:11, where Paul is writing to Gentiles in the church. He's dealing with an issue there, and therefore remember that formerly you, the Gentiles, in the flesh. So he's looking at those of us who are Gentiles from a fleshly point of view. And as he goes through and talks about them, he comes to verse 12 and he says, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, because the Christ was promised to Israel. Paul says that in Romans 9. We saw that a couple weeks ago. They are cut off or alienated, politically alienated them from the politics of Israel. And very important here, strangers with regard to, or strangers from the covenants that consist of promise. So God was not making covenant promises to Gentiles. Were Gentiles encompassed to some degree in the covenant promises God made to Abraham? Yes, because he said nations are going to come from you. Not just a nation, nations and kings will come from you. But chiefly those promises were about Abraham's family and the land that they were going to possess. That was God's promise. And so when God made these promises to Abraham, he wasn't really making most of these promises to the rest of the world for the most part, which meant that for the 2,000 years, the rest of the world went on, just as Paul says here. He says it right here, strangers to those covenants. If you disagree with that and think that those promises were all for them, you need to take it up with Paul, because he's the one that says, we were strangers. We weren't part of the parties involved in that covenant. And so when we go back over to Romans 11, I believe that rootstock is referring to where God was dealing. It had to do with the family of Israel and where he was making these covenants. And so he's warning now the Gentiles not to boast against that. Now, the interesting thing I would say about this, and we're going to bring this up again as we continue going through this material today and into tomorrow at least, that Paul, when he warns about boasting against, it's but a problem that the church has had. Through much of its history, the church has had a boast against the people of Israel. And they've accused Israel of being Christ killers and things such as this. And granted, they said, hey, his blood be on our hands. They said that in the trial. And the early church recognized, you're the ones that took him and put him on a cross. You're the ones that had through the hands of lawless men, you had him crucified. But they did not act as though those people, as though Israel, were in some way less than we were. They recognized a universal guilt borne by both us as well as the Jewish people. And I think that that's very important for us to recognize that it's a universal guilt. In fact, Paul builds that case back in Romans 3 that Israel actually served by their guilt to demonstrate that the whole world, not just Israel, the whole world is guilty. The whole world is guilty. Stop and think about that. We'll come back and we'll pick this up tomorrow, and we'll look a little bit more of what Paul is getting at. But I want you to think about that. None of us came into our salvation with anything better than anybody else. The good news promise was presented to us of forgiveness of sins and righteousness with God. And then guess what? We believed that, and God forgave us. It's as simple as that. It wasn't because we were no more noble than they were, because we were a superior race in any way. Not at all. God sees all of us as in need of salvation. And if you've never heard that before, then I trust today maybe you think about, hey, we all stand guilty before God. But Jesus Christ bore our guilt by dying on the cross for our sins, by being buried and rising again. And you can be saved by believing that. You can be forgiven. If you have believed that, then take this to heart. Take this to heart, that you simply stand by faith in this work that God has done. Trust that encourages you to think about the fact that, hey, when you struggle, remember, you didn't come into salvation because you were better or more noble than anybody else. We all came in as those that were guilty and for whom Christ died. Came in on an equal footing in that regard. And that's something that'll help you become more stable and hopefully encourage you, as always, to have a good day in that Lord who died on the cross for us. Thank you for joining me today.